Okay, hi everybody. I'm here with my marine management organisation hat on. I have a post that is equivalent to 1 day a week with the marine management organisation. I think it's quite a privilege to work for that organisation, and I wanted to take the opportunity to tell you effectively what that organisation does, particularly in this context of multiple use of the marine environment. For those of you who know, my other hat is that I still do work. Somebody came to me and said, "Oh, you don't work here anymore," and I do still work for Plymouth Marine Laboratory, so I do sit with two hats on. Okay, so the MMO is the public body that regulates the seas around England, and it has a vision which is to promote growth in the marine area in a sustainable way, to transform coastal communities while at the same time protecting and enhancing the marine environment. What does the Marine Management Organisation do? Well, it does a lot. It does marine licensing for different works. It responds, or it has a response role in marine emergencies such as oil spills. It's responsible for fisheries management and enforcement, marine nature conservation and enforcement, and it provides advice to the government on marine issues, so it needs a marine evidence base and knowledge management. And of course that all-important role, marine planning, more of which later. So I'm going to just rush through some of those areas about what the MMO does. As I say, really just to tell you the sort of things it does and give you a few statistics every now and then of how much of it does. So the MMO is responsible for compliance with the Common Fisheries Policy. At the moment it's involved in the consultations contributing to the reform of the CFP. It regulates and enforces fishing fleet capacity and quotas, and it manages EU grants, particularly the European Fisheries Fund, which helps to support some fishing activity, make it more sustainable, make it more environmentally friendly, but also supports the communities around fisheries. Some examples of those specifics: it licenses the vessels, it manages the fleet capacities and the fisheries quotas. It collects and coordinates and provides the information related to fisheries management. So on the MMO website, you'll see fisheries landings, fish fleet sizes, all of that sort of information. You can get VMS data here. Don't get me started on VMS. I know it's a problem. It's a legal problem. So I would probably refer you back to Daniel if you want to know about why the MMO can't give you the VMS data you'd really, really like as scientists, and I get frustrated too. It's responsible for monitoring and control of fisheries catch and effort, and it does do the enforcement stuff. They do the vessel inspections. There are coastal offices all around the coast. They go out on the vessels, they board them, they check for infringements. Where they see an infringement, they'll offer maybe advice. They maybe will offer written warnings. Sometimes they'll offer penalties, and they will go to court if they have to. But that's kind of an option of last resort, really. But they will do it. They're also involved in marine nature conservation and enforcement, including setting up bylaws, issuing wildlife licenses, and they will be responsible for enforcing marine protected areas as they come online in the marine conservation zones. They work very closely with others such as Natural England, JNCC, the IFCAs, the Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authorities, and the stakeholders. And I looked at some data on how the nature conservation works, and I put up a smattering of examples with a few underlines that say that this isn't about setting up laws or bylaws, there is a whole mixture of approaches that the nature enforcement people undertake, including engagement with the stakeholders, including agreement with the fishermen, including setting license conditions, trialling different types of VMS to help reduce catch in areas where people shouldn't be catching. I can talk more about that if anybody's interested in the coffee times or in the breaks. So they have a whole range of different ways in which they go around conservation. It's not just about legislation and enforcing legislation or introducing new legislation. They're involved in the marine emergency response. So they look at if an emergency happens, what is the environmental response going to be? They will actually have to say within an hour of a request being made, they have to give advice or withhold authorization for the use of oil spill treatment products. And that has to happen within an hour of them being notified or asked. And again, to do that, they coordinate different people's advice from the coastal offices, from CFAS, from the National England, JNCC, Countryside Commission for Wales, Food Standard Agency, etc. They're involved in contingency planning. A fairly interesting example of that was the MSC Flaminia, which I suspect most people don't know about. It caught fire out there in the Atlantic, about 200 miles off the UK coast. It carried an awful lot of very, very hazardous materials. 2 people sadly lost their lives on board during the fire. It was viewed as being extremely hazardous. It sat there for 6 weeks while a whole bunch of people, including the MMO, and I think also CFAS, tried to decide what to do with it and what to allow it to do. Eventually, when the fires calmed down enough after 6 weeks, and after people had been on board to inspect it, it was allowed to limp its way to, I'm not sure if it's its home port or its owner's port. I think it's now successfully berthed somewhere near Hamburg, and a whole lot of people have let out a huge sigh of relief that it got there safely. We were really worried what was going to happen with that. Marine planning, that's the biggie that's going on. As was referred to earlier, it's happening off the east coast, the inshore and offshore region. There are 10 marine plan areas. The whole idea of marine planning is to translate national and EU policy at the local level. So that's things like the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, obviously the Marine and Coastal Access Act, national policy that was included in that act, Marine Policy Statement, etc. The idea is that it should be integrated. It should examine all the options and impacts of developments in consultation with the stakeholders. And the first 2 draft marine plans have been written. They are being consulted on internally and with DEFRA at the moment, and then they will go out for external consultation. This has involved a huge amount of consultation with stakeholders. It will be interesting to see after time whether the stakeholders feel that there was enough consultation, but I know that the MMO did everything that they felt they could to engage with the stakeholders. So what's happened? This has been a process that started a while back. It'll be about 2 years by the time it finally gets completed. An evidence base was assembled. I've no idea if you can see this slide anywhere near the back, but an evidence base was assembled around those areas. The issues were identified. A vision has been set, and some options for actually setting out that vision. Particularly the vision, there were objectives and some options. We're now at this point where the plan has been developed, a preferred option has been set, it is gone, and it's going for internal consultation, and it will go out to external consultation again in January next year. Then it will be revised, because of course there will be differences of opinion, and hopefully signed off in about April next year with some review. Now, most of the planners do feel this is the first time a plan has been done in the UK. They've done, I think, the best job that they think they can do. They've learned a lot of lessons. They will learn a lot of lessons. The next plan area is the South Coast, and that will be done in a similar way, but better. And each time they do it, it will get better. At least I think that's the aspiration. I think also they're aware that these might need to be revised, reviewed more quickly than originally planned, particularly these early ones, in light of the fact that this is the first attempt at doing this. So we have the evidence and issues. This was published on the website in February 2012. So it explains some of the issues around that area. So it's some of the evidence. They've come up with a vision, and here are some of the objectives. There are 3 economic objectives, 3 social objectives, 3 environmental objectives. I'm not sure that they did that just to be balanced. I think that's just how it came out, again, in consultation. climate change objectives, a governance objective, and an objective to improve the evidence base, because that's definitely needed. Some of the key issues that came out, I'm not going to read all of this out, but there will be changes in the future, and how well are those addressed in marine planning? There's a need to avoid duplication with other policies, with other plans, or with other approaches. Clearly a need for more evidence and research on current activities, understanding the sort of future distributions of environmental, well, the current distributions of environmental features. We don't know what's on the seabed in a lot of cases, in large areas around the UK. And what the benefits are, what are the current benefits, and what are the future changes going to be. A certain amount of kind of guessing it as you go along. And the response to pressures, and especially the cumulative and interactive ones. There was a lot of need to provide more explanation and guidance to the stakeholders that were consulted. What was the relation to terrestrial and other plans? What's the relationship to the national planning policy framework, etc.? So those issues, by identifying those issues, they came up with a series of options, and I think it's okay to say that one of those, two of the options are, well, the options are focusing around that there will be a growth of renewables, and they want to have a growth of renewables, particularly on the East Coast. That does involve grid, cables, supply chain, etc. So you've got a plan for that. And there will be a future growth in aggregate extraction because aggregates are needed for building. There are going to be concerns about the interactions with fisheries, with shipping routes. Largely shipping routes have been preserved and protected. Tourism and recreation, what are the effect of other activities on those things? And obviously the oil and gas. There's issues around cables, and we have to preserve, make sure that there are places for cables to come ashore. Trying to preserve a seascape that people are going to be happy with, the seascape being that what do we look out onto, as kind of has come up a little bit earlier in the discussions about environment and human health, or oceans and human health. People's interaction with their marine environment is important. Again, Daniel's already said that he's seen an awful lot of military activity out there. You've only got to look out the window, and that's your seascape when you're living in a place like this. And obviously the interactions with the ecosystem. How are marine renewables and aggregates going to continue to interact, and those cumulative effects with the different mobile species, the seabed habitats, etc. And of course marine protected areas. But the marine protected areas haven't kind of come in, so it's a bit chicken and egg. We think the marine protected areas are going to be there, so we're putting the space around where the marine protected should be, but it's a little bit chicken and egg at the moment. Alongside marine planning, which says roughly where things are going to go, is marine licensing. So if you're a wind turbine developer and you've been allocated a space in the North Sea to develop lots of wind turbines, that's great, but then you have to go and get effectively what in the terrestrial world would be called planning permission. In other words, a license to go and put your marine farm in the space which you've been given a lease to put it in. So you maybe buy the land, or get your lease to the land, but then you've got to get permission to build your house, or in this case your turbines, on it. And that's, in a nutshell, what licensing is. And it's licensing for things like that, for marine work such as ports and marina development, dredging, for extraction of minerals, also for harbour orders. The MMO has developed a streamlined system. They're very proud of it. They are trying rapidly they're trying to make marine license provision much more rapid. They're trying to process these things fast. They, I think, just recruited 15 more members of staff because the actual amount of effort that's involved around marine licensing is, I think, a lot more than was originally anticipated. So since April 2011, 296 license applications, which were processed largely within 13 weeks, which is pretty fast. The MMO does value evidence and data and knowledge management. It has a strategic evidence plan, which is identifying its evidence needs, in this case, and also including its research needs, which is kind of important for this audience. It's important for the research councils. It's important for DEFRA. It's signalling to what the MMOs, to these organisations and to the research community, what are the MMO's priorities? So if you like, it's wish list. The MMO has a very small research budget. It's now working with DEFRA to commission some of this evidence through framework agreements. So a lot of the research community will be aware of that at the moment. The other strand is that the MMO is trying to be extremely rigorous on quality assurance systems and putting them in place for marine data, particularly for its licensing processes, for the evidence that it holds to support marine planning, fisheries, etc. And it's trying to create quality management systems. Just to give you a very brief idea of what these look like, every time they look at data, they say, is this data, what is the purpose of the evidence? Is it supporting the MMO requirements? What would good evidence look like? Is there a risk if the evidence isn't good enough? Is there a risk in terms of being able to deliver a good decision on licensing or on planning or on conservation enforcement? Is there a financial risk, a reputational risk? The MMO is a government agency, so it does have to look at its reputation. And also, is there a legal risk? Is there going to be a risk that if evidence is misused or isn't appropriate, there are legal ramifications? They look at the data, must have, should have, could have, would like. I suspect in most cases they don't have the would likes, the could haves, the should haves, and they probably haven't even got enough of the must haves, but that's the way evidence goes. Looking at the validity of data, the accuracy and the timeliness, etc. We've had sort of discussions about how one set of data that they have might be great for one thing, but isn't appropriate for another decision they have to make, and they've had to kind of consider those sort of things. Peer review, they value very highly scientific peer review. As those of us who've published in scientific journals may know, maybe scientific peer review isn't quite as much as it's cut out to be, but they value it highly, so that's good. And if there are any caveats, they include those in their assessments. This is my final slide. Arguably, and I have argued it with people, there is a culture of transparency and openness and accountability at the MMO. They do try and publish all their decisions on their website. They do try and give the indications for why they've made those decisions. Some of those decisions are unpopular. They make decisions which people don't like. That's what they have to do in licensing, and it will happen to a certain extent in marine planning. And they try and be as open about why they came to those decisions as they possibly can. But that's their role, is to make decisions sometimes. And when they do take those decisions, they have to take into account those three themes: economy, social, and environment. In other words, the coastal communities and their environment and the marine environment. And they also have to take into account their role as the regulators, their role as bringing forward this sustainable vision. Okay, thank you very much.